The rain on a Tuesday night in the city of Oakhaven had a particular sound. It wasn't the gentle, renewing sound of a spring shower. It was a tired, persistent hiss that slicked the asphalt and reflected the city's neon signs in long, distorted streaks. For Officer Ben Carter, 15 years on the force, it was the soundtrack of his life. He sat in his patrol car, the engine humming a low, monotonous tune, and took a sip of lukewarm coffee from a dented thermos. It tasted like bitter routine. Outside, the world was a watercolor painting bleeding at the edges. Inside, his world was the squeak of the windshield wipers rhythmically fighting the drizzle, the faint scent of wet wool from his uniform, and the disembodied voice from the police scanner. Domestic dispute on Elm, Unit 3 respond. Report of a possible 459 at the downtown liquor store. All units be advised. It was a litany of the city's mundane miseries, a playlist he knew by heart. Ben had once been the eager rookie, the cop who believed the badge was a shield and the law was a sword. Now, at 42, he felt more like a janitor, endlessly mopping up the same spills in the same dark hallways. The optimism had been worn down, eroded by years of seeing the worst of people, by the endless paperwork that followed every moment of adrenaline, and by the ghosts of the faces he couldn't save. His partner for the night, a young, talkative officer named Ricky, was yammering on about his fantasy football league. Ben tuned him out, his gaze fixed on the passing streetlights. He wasn't a bad cop, he was just a tired one. The fire was still there, but it had banked low, buried under a thick layer of cynicism and fatigue. It took something specific to stir the embers. A call came through, not for them, but for a different unit. A noise complaint at the rundown Crestview apartment complex, a place that generated more calls than any other block in their precinct. It was the kind of call Ben had handled 1,000 times, one that usually ended with a half-hearted warning and the promise of a return visit. As they drove past the complex, his headlights swept across the parking lot and caught a small, shivering shape huddled near a dumpster. "Hold up," Ben said, pulling the car over. Ricky stopped mid-sentence. "What's up? It's just a stray." "Maybe," Ben said. But he was already opening his door, the rain instantly plastering his short brown hair to his scalp. It was a small terrier mix, its fur matted and soaked, whimpering softly. It wasn't feral. It wore a collar. Ben knelt, his knees cracking in protest. He spoke in a low, soothing voice, extending the back of his hand. The dog, after a moment's hesitation, crept forward and licked his knuckles. Its whole body trembled, not just from the cold, but from fear. "See, not a stray," Ben said as Ricky came up behind him. He gently worked his fingers under the wet collar and found the tags. The engraving was worn, but he could just make out a name, Scrappy, and an address. It was an apartment in this very complex. "Animal control's just going to take him to the pound," Ricky stated, a fact they both knew. "It's past 10 p.m. We should just call it in." Ben looked at the address on the tag, then at the terrified dog. He thought of the bureaucratic void the animal would fall into, the cold cage, the uncertainty. He thought of its owner, probably worried sick. He sighed. "No. Let's take him home." 15 minutes later, they were standing outside apartment 2B. The door was opened by a tiny, white-haired woman leaning heavily on a walker. Her face, a road map of worried wrinkles, collapsed in relief when she saw the dog in Ben's arms. "Scrappy, oh, thank heavens, I was so worried he must have slipped out when I went to get the mail," she cried, her voice frail. Ben gently handed the dog over. The woman hugged the animal to her chest, burying her face in its wet fur. "Thank you, officer. Thank you so much. I don't know what I'd do without him. He's all I have." Ben just nodded. "Glad we could help. Ma'am, have a good night." As they walked back to the patrol car, Ricky shook his head. "You're a real softy. You know that." Ben didn't answer. It wasn't about being soft. It was about seeing a small, fixable problem in a world full of broken things and choosing to fix it. It was about returning something that was lost. It was a small act of order in a universe of chaos. For a moment, the job felt simple again. Later, the quiet camaraderie in the car was broken by a news report on the radio. It was a follow-up on a recent child abduction case. A grim story with a tragic ending. Ricky clicked it off. "Can't listen to those," Ricky said, shivering theatrically. "Cases with kids. They get under my skin." Ben's hands tightened on the steering wheel. A shadow passed over his features, a cloud obscuring the brief moment of light from his good deed. "Yeah," he said, his voice flat. "Me too." He didn't elaborate, but his mind was involuntarily pulled back 5 years, to a name that was permanently etched into the scarred tissue of his memory: Amberfield. The Amberfield case, a messy custody battle, a welfare check he had conducted himself. The mother was a nervous wreck, the father slick and charming. The house was clean, the little girl quiet and withdrawn. Ben had noted it in his report, that she seemed too quiet, but the father had explained she was just shy. Ben had let it go. He'd followed procedure. A week later, the father vanished with the girl. They were never found. He had missed it. The signs had been there, subtle and quiet, but he had missed them. He had followed the rules, checked the boxes, and a child had been lost to the system, swallowed by the darkness. That failure had become a part of him, a cold knot of guilt that tightened whenever he saw a child in need. It was the reason he'd returned the dog. It was the reason he looked twice at every domestic dispute, searching for the silent victims. It was the reason the embers of his passion, buried so deep, were not yet extinguished. They were waiting for a spark, waiting for a chance at redemption. As he steered the car through the rain-swept streets, Ben Carter had no idea that spark was coming. He didn't know that a 911 call was about to come over the radio that would not only shatter his routine, but would also drag him into a darkness far deeper than the one that haunted his past. The spark arrived just before midnight. It crackled over the radio, a dispatcher's voice cutting through the static with an urgency that sliced through Ben's fatigue. "All available units in Sector 4 respond to a possible structure fire at 12 Gablewood Drive. In the Heights, repeat, active fire reported at 12 Gablewood Drive. Fire and rescue en route." Ricky sat up straight. "The Heights, that's Mansion territory." Ben didn't respond. He had already flipped on the sirens and was pushing the patrol car through the slick, empty streets, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The Heights was a world away from the gritty reality of their usual patrol route. It was a secluded enclave of manicured lawns, towering oak trees, and sprawling estates hidden behind wrought iron gates, a place where trouble was something that happened to other people. They were the first to arrive. The scene was surreal. A magnificent 3-story colonial mansion, a fortress of wealth and privilege, had a plume of thick black smoke billowing from a second-story window. An angry orange glow pulsed within, illuminating the pouring rain. "Stay with the car. Call it in again. Confirm fire is active," Ben commanded, his voice all business. The weariness had vanished, replaced by the sharp focus of adrenaline. As he ran toward the house, he could hear the faint, distant wail of fire trucks. But they were minutes away, too far away. His eyes scanned the front of the house, and his heart seized. Framed in a large window on the second floor, surrounded by a churning vortex of smoke, was the small, pale silhouette of a child. Time seemed to warp. The image of the trapped child superimposed itself over the ghost of the Amberfield girl in his mind. The same vulnerability, the same silent plea. "Wait for the fire department!" Ben Ricky yelled from the car, his voice tight with panic. "That's protocol. The whole damn place could go up." But Ben wasn't listening to protocol. He was listening to the roaring in his own head, the voice of his past failure screaming at him. Not again. Never again. He kicked the heavy oak front door. It didn't budge. Without a second thought, he grabbed a large stone garden gnome from the manicured flower bed and hurled it through a plate glass window next to the entrance. The sound of shattering glass was sharp and violent. He reached through, unlocked the door, and plunged into the smoke. The heat was a physical blow. The air was thick and acrid, burning his lungs. He pulled the collar of his uniform over his mouth and nose, his eyes streaming. "Is anyone here?" he yelled, his voice swallowed by the roar of the fire. He took the grand sweeping staircase 2 steps at a time, his hand trailing along the wall to guide him. The fire seemed to be concentrated at the end of the upstairs hall. He sprinted toward the room where he'd seen the child, kicking the door open. The room was an inferno. Flames licked up the silk curtains and devoured a large, ornate bed. In the far corner, near the window, a small boy was huddled on the floor, his body still. He was about 8 years old, with dark hair and pale skin. Ben scooped the child into his arms. The boy was eerily light, a fragile weight against his chest. He turned to go back, but the fire had spread, cutting off the doorway with a wall of flame. The window was their only escape. He used his service baton to smash the glass, then carefully shielded the boy's body with his own as he climbed out onto a narrow stone ledge. Below, the first fire engine screamed to a halt on the sweeping driveway. Firefighters spilled out, their faces turning up toward him. He could see Ricky, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. "I've got him!" Ben yelled, his voice raw. "Bring a ladder!" The moments that followed were a blur of coordinated chaos. A ladder was raised. A firefighter climbed up to meet him, helping him secure his hold on the unconscious child as he made the terrifying descent. As his feet touched the solid, wet ground, a wave of relief so powerful it made his knees buckle washed over him. He had done it. He had cheated the ghost. He carried the boy away from the house, just as a sleek black Mercedes screeched to a halt at the end of the drive. A man and a woman, impeccably dressed despite the late hour, scrambled out of the car, their faces canvases of perfectly rendered panic. The woman shrieked, running toward them. "My baby." They were the Vances. Julian Vance was tall and handsome, with silvering temples and the confident air of a man used to owning every room he entered. His wife, Eleanor, was impossibly elegant, a classic beauty whose terror seemed almost art-directed. They descended on Ben, showering him with frantic, breathless gratitude. "You saved him, you saved our son. You're a hero," Eleanor cried, reaching for the child. Ben knelt and carefully transferred the boy into his mother's arms, and that's when he felt the first cold prickle of unease. As Eleanor clutched her son, Leo remained limp, his head lolling to the side. There was no instinctive turning toward his mother's voice, no reflexive tightening of his arms. It was like handing a doll from one person to another. Ben's cop eyes, trained to see the details, took in the scene. He looked at the boy's small, soot-stained hand, which lay limp against his mother's expensive coat. And on the delicate skin of the boy's inner wrist, he saw it. It was a small, perfectly round burn mark, the size of a dime. It wasn't a fresh burn from the fire. The edges were scarred over, pale and puckered. It looked less like an accidental injury and more like a brand. "He's got a burn here," Ben said, his voice quiet but firm, pointing to the mark. "Did this just happen?" Julian Vance's head snapped toward him. For a fraction of a second, his mask of grateful panic slipped, revealing a flash of something cold and hard underneath. It was gone as quickly as it came. "Oh, that," he said dismissively, forcing a pained smile. "That's an old thing. An accident in the kitchen a few months ago. Silly boy got too close to a hot pan." Eleanor quickly pulled the boy's sleeve down, concealing the mark. "The paramedics are here," she said, her voice a little too high, a little too bright, as an ambulance crew approached with a stretcher. "Thank you again, officer. We are forever in your debt." They turned their full attention to the paramedics, effectively dismissing him. Ben stood back, watching as they loaded Leo onto the stretcher. He watched the Vances, their performance of frantic parental concern now seeming just that, a performance. They were saying all the right words, making all the right gestures, but there was a hollowness to it, a staged quality that set his teeth on edge. Ricky came up beside him, clapping him on the back. "Man, that was insane. You're going to get a medal for this. Ben, you're a hero." Ben didn't feel like a hero. He felt a deep, gut-level certainty that he had just rescued a child from one fire, only to hand him back to another. One that was colder and far more sinister. The way the Vances had dismissed the burn, the boy's strange lack of response, the flash of ice in the father's eyes. It was the Amberfield case all over again. But this time the signs weren't just subtle warnings. They were screaming at him. He had crossed a line when he ran into that house. He had made it personal. And as he stood in the rain, watching the ambulance pull away, he knew he had passed a point of no return. He couldn't just file the report and let this go. He had to know the truth. He had to know what was happening inside the gilded cage of 12 Gablewood Drive. The embers of the fire at 12 Gablewood Drive cooled, but the fire in Ben Carter's gut only burned hotter. He was a hero in the press. A local news channel ran a short, flattering piece on the brave officer who risked all for child, complete with a slightly too enthusiastic interview with his partner, Ricky. To his colleagues, he was the guy who got lucky, the veteran who had a moment of glory. But Ben felt none of it. The praise felt hollow, the heroism a sham, because his instincts screamed that the real danger to Leo Vance wasn't in a burning room, but in the cold, perfectly appointed rooms of the mansion itself. His talent, the thing that separated him from cops like Ricky, was not brute force or brilliant deductions, but a relentless, dogged patience and an eye for details that didn't fit. It was the grit of old-school police work. On his next day off, he didn't rest. He sat at his kitchen table with a fresh legal pad and a hot cup of coffee and began to dig. The Vances, on the surface, were flawless. Julian Vance was a private equity visionary, a philanthropist whose name was on the wings of hospitals and museums. Eleanor Vance was a society darling, chairwoman of multiple children's charities. Their public records were pristine, their digital footprint curated to perfection. They were too perfect. It was like a house with no dust, a sign that it wasn't a home, but a stage. Ben worked his way through official channels. He pulled the initial fire report, which had been filed by the lead arson investigator, a senior, by-the-book detective named Frank Miller. Ben's eyebrows shot up as he read it. The investigation was concluded in less than 12 hours. The cause was listed as accidental, suspected faulty wiring in a bedside lamp. It was neat, tidy, and remarkably fast for a fire in a multi-million-dollar home involving an endangered child. Too fast. This was the first crack in the facade, driven by the memory of the Amberfield case, where he had failed to act on his gut feeling. Ben decided to push. He couldn't open an official investigation based on a hunch. He would be laughed out of the precinct. So he did the next best thing. He used a burner phone he kept for emergencies and made a call. "Child Protective Services," a tired voice answered. "I'd like to make an anonymous report," Ben said, his voice low and disguised. "It's regarding the welfare of a child named Leo Vance, 12 Gablewood Drive. There was a fire. I think someone needs to take a closer look." He provided no details, no accusations, just a seed of doubt. He gave the boy's name and address and hung up. He had lit a small fire of his own, hoping it would illuminate something he couldn't see. That anonymous tip, a single drop in an ocean of cases, landed on the desk of Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was a CPS caseworker, young but already possessing the weary eyes of a veteran. She was sharp, empathetic, and deeply cynical about the systems she worked within, but fiercely dedicated to the children caught in their gears. A call about the Vances was unusual. The wealthy families of the Heights were adept at keeping their secrets locked behind high walls and teams of lawyers. She conducted the welfare check the next day. The Vance mansion was intimidating, a palace of cold marble and intimidating modern art. Eleanor Vance greeted her with a practiced, charming smile, offering her tea in a porcelain cup. The house was immaculate. Leo was brought in, dressed in a crisp polo shirt and khakis. He looked clean, well-fed, and physically unharmed. He answered Sarah's questions politely. in quiet monosyllables, his eyes constantly flicking toward his mother. "Do you like your school, Leo?" Sarah asked gently. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "Are you happy here?" A pause. Eleanor's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course he is," she interjected smoothly. "He has everything a boy could want. We were just so terrified after the fire, weren't we?" "Darling," Leo nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. Sarah left the mansion with a profound sense of unease. Everything was perfect on the surface, but it felt wrong. It was like watching a beautifully directed play. The family's interactions felt rehearsed. Leo's responses coached. There were no smudges, no signs of genuine, messy family life. Later that day, she did some digging of her own. She saw Officer Ben Carter's name on the initial fire response report. Taking a chance, she found his number and called him. "Officer Carter," she began. "My name is Sarah Jenkins, from CPS. I'm calling unofficially about the anonymous tip regarding Leo Vance. I have a feeling that tip might have been professionally sourced." Ben was silent for a moment. "What did you see, Ms. Jenkins?" "I saw a perfect family in a perfect house," she said, "and it was the most unsettling thing I've seen all month." They cautiously shared their suspicions, Ben's about the boy's detached behavior and the strange burn mark. Sarah's about the staged perfection of the home environment. They were two professionals from different worlds, united by the same gut feeling that something was terribly wrong. They agreed to keep in touch, two lone soldiers watching the same fortress. Meanwhile, Ben's unofficial inquiries hadn't gone unnoticed. Julian Vance, a man who treated information as power, had been alerted by one of his many friends in the city administration that a patrol officer was looking into his family. Vance didn't panic. He made a quiet, friendly phone call to an old acquaintance from his golf club, Detective Frank Miller. Miller was a man who believed in order and procedure. He had little patience for patrol cops who thought they were detectives. When he received a call from a man as powerful and respected as Julian Vance, who expressed his deep concern that his family was being harassed by a clearly traumatized and overzealous officer after the fire, Miller's annoyance was easily stoked. The next day, Miller cornered Ben by the precinct's coffee machine. He was a large man who used his physical presence as an intimidation tool. "Carter," he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "A word." He led Ben into a small, empty interrogation room. "I got a call from Julian Vance," Miller began, skipping any pretense of friendliness. "He tells me you're poking your nose where it doesn't belong, questioning my fire report, making waves." "I have concerns about the kid," Ben said calmly, refusing to be intimidated. Miller scoffed. "You have a hero complex. You pulled a kid from a fire. Good for you. But that doesn't make you a detective. You're a glorified traffic cop. I'm the lead investigator on this. I closed the case because it was accidental. The Vances are pillars of this community, and the last thing they need is some beat cop with a persecution complex harassing them while they're grieving." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a low growl. "This is your one and only warning. You are to cease all contact and all inquiries regarding the Vance family. You will do your patrols, you will write your tickets, and you will leave the real police work to the detectives. Am I understood?" Ben stared back, his jaw tight. He was being shut down by his own department. The wall around the Vances wasn't just money and lawyers. It was made of blue bricks, too. He was being officially warned, his concerns dismissed and his character attacked. The path forward had just become infinitely more dangerous. "Understood, Detective," Ben said, his voice flat. But as he walked out of the room, he knew he had no intention of obeying. Miller hadn't just warned him off. He had confirmed that the secret the Vances were hiding was powerful enough to bend the will of a senior detective. The confrontation had solidified his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for Leo anymore. He was fighting a system that chose to protect the powerful over the powerless. Detective Miller's warning had the opposite of its intended effect. It didn't frighten Ben into submission. It lit a fuse. The official command to stand down was a confirmation that the walls protecting the Vances were not just high, but actively defended from the inside. He was no longer just a concerned officer. He was a dissident. His isolation became a tangible thing, a cold bubble that surrounded him at the precinct. His partner, Ricky, now treated him with a cautious distance, his usual stream of chatter replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The story had spread. Ben Carter, the one-time hero, was now Ben Carter, the obsessive cop who was harassing a good, powerful family. He was a problem. He ate his meals alone, his shifts passing in a lonely, self-imposed quarantine. He was a ghost haunting his own department. The gilded cage of the Vance mansion dominated his thoughts. He drove by it on his patrols, a magnificent fortress of white columns and perfectly symmetrical windows that stared back at him with a blank, cold indifference. It was a beautiful prison, he thought. Its beauty a form of camouflage, its wealth a shield. What happened within those walls remained a poisonous secret, and the clock was ticking. The frantic call from Sarah Jenkins came on a Thursday afternoon, just as Ben was ending his shift. Her voice was thin and tight with a barely controlled panic. "They're running, Ben," she said, her words tumbling out. "They're running." "What are you talking about?" Sarah, slow down. "The Vances," she explained, her breath ragged. "I have a source, a friend who works at the federal building. She processes passport applications. She called me as a favor. The Vances filed an expedited application for Leo 2 days ago. It was just approved. I did more digging. Ben, I called a contact I have at a high-end travel agency. The Vances booked 3 one-way first-class tickets to the Cayman Islands. The flight leaves Saturday morning. Saturday morning. It was Thursday afternoon. He had less than 48 hours. "A non-extradition country," Ben said, the words tasting like ash. It was a classic move for the wealthy and the guilty. "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "Once he's on that plane, he's gone. He'll vanish. Ben, we'll never see him again. He'll become another ghost, another Amberfield." The name hit him like a punch to the gut. "Can't you get a warrant? An emergency order to hold the child?" Ben asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "On what grounds?" Sarah's voice was laced with the bitter frustration he knew so well. "I have a bad feeling. You have a hunch. A judge would laugh me out of court. The Vances would have my job before the end of the day. Their lawyer would argue it's just a family vacation, and we're harassing them. Legally. Ben, my hands are tied. We have nothing concrete." Nothing concrete. The phrase echoed in his mind. He had gut feelings, suspicious circumstances, and a burn mark. It was smoke, but he needed to find the fire, and the fire was inside that house. He hung up the phone, a cold sense of dread washing over him. This was the ultimate test, the final gauntlet. He was completely and utterly alone. Miller had officially warned him off, threatening his career. His own partner believed he was unstable. Sarah, his only ally, was powerless. The system, the very institution he had sworn to uphold, was now his primary obstacle. It was protecting the cage instead of the child trapped within it. 48 hours. He went home, but he couldn't rest. He paced his small apartment, his mind a whirlwind of dead ends and impossible choices. He could leak his suspicions to the press, but the Vance's PR team would shred him. He could try to confront them directly, but they would simply deny everything and have him arrested for trespassing. Every official door was closed and bolted. The only option left was the one he'd been avoiding, the one that would mean crossing the final line from a protector of the law to a breaker of it. He had to get inside that house. He had to find the proof himself, before they could flee. He spent the next 24 hours in a fever of preparation. He used his police access, what little he had left, to pull the architectural blueprints for the Vance mansion from the city's planning department. He studied them, memorizing the layout, the entrances, the potential hiding places. He called Sarah. "I need to know everything you saw inside that house," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Every detail. The layout of the father's study. Any rooms that seemed off limits. Anything. Sarah, sensing the desperation and resolve in his voice, gave him a meticulous description. She told him about the large, ornate bookshelf in Julian Vance's study that seemed oddly out of place with the rest of the minimalist decor. She mentioned that when she had asked to use the restroom, Eleanor had steered her to one downstairs, insisting the upstairs was being redecorated. A bookshelf. It was a classic trope, but in a house this carefully staged, it was a possibility. The final piece of his plan fell into place when he saw a society news alert on his computer. Vance family to host annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala. The event was Friday night, tomorrow night, the night before the flight. It was the perfect cover. The house would be full of people, staff, and distractions. The security would be focused on the guests at the front of the house, not on a lone figure slipping in through the back. As he finalized his desperate, reckless plan, Ben was keenly aware of the irony. To save Leo from the gilded cage, he had to break into it. To uphold the spirit of the law, he had to shatter its letter. He was betting his career, his freedom, and possibly his life on a single hunch. He looked at a worn photo on his mantelpiece, a picture of him on his graduation day from the police academy, his face young and full of conviction. He wondered what that young man would think of him now. He hoped he would understand, because as the city lights began to twinkle outside his window, Ben Carter knew, with absolute certainty, that he would rather be a good man who broke the rules than a good cop who let another child disappear into the dark. The Vance mansion was a spectacle of blinding light and hollow laughter. Music from a string quartet spilled out onto the rain-soaked lawn, mingling with the murmur of the city's elite. Bentleys and Rolls-Royces lined the sweeping driveway, disgorging men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns. It was a perfect illusion, a fortress of philanthropy and power, and Ben Carter was about to breach its walls. Dressed in dark clothing, his face set in a grim mask, Ben slipped through the shadows of the sprawling estate grounds. He moved with a predator's silence, his senses on high alert. The charity gala was in full swing, a loud, vibrant distraction that drew all eyes to the front of the house. Ben's target was the back. He found the service entrance he'd marked on the blueprints, hidden behind a lattice of ivy. The lock was simple, a tradesman's lock, and his police-issue multi-tool made short work of it. He slipped inside, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was in. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the faint, distant sounds of the party. Guided by his memorized map of the house and Sarah's description, he navigated the labyrinthine servants' corridors. He moved like a ghost through the opulent world of the Vances, a world of polished marble and cold, imposing art. He reached Julian Vance's study. The door was unlocked. The room was a masterpiece of masculine elegance, dark wood paneling, leather-bound books that looked like they had never been opened, and a massive mahogany desk. And there, against the far wall, was the bookshelf Sarah had described. It was ornate, intricately carved, and looked ancient, a stark contrast to the study's clean, modern lines. It didn't belong. Ben's instincts screamed. He ran his hands along the carved edges of the bookshelf, pushing, pulling, searching for a seam, a switch, a hidden latch. Nothing. He stepped back, frustration mounting. The clock was ticking. The Vances could return at any moment. He scanned the books. They were all classics, perfectly aligned. His eyes caught one title, The Count of Monte Cristo, a tale of wrongful imprisonment and meticulous revenge. On impulse, he pulled it. It didn't move like a normal book. It tilted forward with a soft, mechanical click. The entire bookshelf swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. A wave of cold dread washed over Ben as he stepped through. This wasn't a hidden safe or a wine cellar. The air was cold, sterile, and silent. He flicked on his small flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The room was small, windowless, and soundproofed with thick, gray acoustic panels. There was a single, bare mattress on the floor, a small table, and in the corner, a heavy steel 4-drawer file cabinet. It wasn't a secret study. It was a cell. It was Leo's real room. Rage, pure and white-hot, surged through him. He channeled it into action, turning his attention to the file cabinet. It was locked. He wedged the tip of a small crowbar from his tool belt into the seam of the top drawer and heaved with all his strength. The metal groaned in protest. He was so focused, so consumed by his task, that he didn't hear the soft click of the bookshelf closing behind him. He didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. "I must say, officer, I'm disappointed. I expected a more subtle approach." The overhead lights flashed on, flooding the small room with a harsh, clinical glare. Ben spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Julian Vance stood in the doorway, blocking the only exit. The charming philanthropist was gone. The man who stood before him was someone else entirely, his face stripped of all warmth, his eyes as cold and dead as a reptile's. In his hand, held with a casual, terrifying stillness, was a small, silver pistol. "You've been a persistent nuisance, Carter," Vance said, his voice a low, conversational purr that was more menacing than any shout. "I admire your tenacity, in a way, but it has led you to a place you shouldn't be." Ben's mind raced, but he was trapped. The soundproofed walls would swallow any cry for help. "Leo is not my son," Vance said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He seemed to be enjoying the confession, the final arrogant display of his power. "He has no name, not really. To us, he is item number 7. A special order for a very wealthy client in Dubai with a particular taste. We don't harm them. Of course, we are not savages. We simply procure them. We provide a boutique service for a clientele with needs that cannot be met through conventional channels." The truth was more monstrous than Ben could have ever imagined. A child trafficking ring, operating out of a palace of philanthropy, catering to the world's elite. The burn on Leo's wrist, it was an identification mark, a brand. The fire was a regrettable accident. Vance continued smoothly. One of the other items we were temporarily housing became difficult. We dealt with it, but the cleanup was messy, and then you had to play the hero. He took a step forward, raising the pistol. And now, it ends. A tragic story. Really, a decorated police officer, obsessed with our family after his heroic rescue, develops a dangerous fixation. He breaks into our home during a charity event. I find him trying to steal my private financial documents. I confront him. He attacks me. I defend myself. A tragedy. But the city will understand. They will see me as the victim. This was it. The absolute end. The all-is-lost moment crashed down on him, suffocating him with its finality. He would die here, in this sterile tomb. And the Vances would walk free. Leo would be put on that plane. The Amberfield case would repeat itself. But this time, he would be the ghost. It was in that moment of pure despair that a new sound entered the silent room. A sound so unexpected, so impossible, it seemed to come from another world. The sharp, metallic click of a gun's hammer being cocked. Julian Vance froze. The sound hadn't come from in front of him. It had come from behind him, from the study. "I don't think so. Mr. Vance," a gravelly voice said. "Drop it. Now." Slowly, Vance turned, standing in the secret doorway, his face grim. His service weapon held in a rock-steady two-handed grip was Detective Frank Miller. Miller's presence was a shock to Vance, but a thunderbolt to Ben. He stared, speechless. "How?" Vance whispered, his cold composure finally cracking. "Let's just say Officer Carter here is more persuasive than I gave him credit for," Miller said, his eyes never leaving Vance. He had received one last desperate text from Ben an hour before, a string of numbers, an offshore account number, an account that Miller, using his detective's credentials to run a fast, high-level check, had found was the endpoint of a money transfer from a known international human trafficker. The seed of doubt Ben had planted had finally, violently, bloomed. Miller had followed his own gut and come to the gala, not as a guest, but as a cop. The standoff was broken by a new sound, gasps and murmurs from the study, drawn by the raised voices. A small crowd of party guests, the cream of Oakhaven society, had gathered at the study door. They stared, champagne flutes frozen in their hands. At the scene unfolding before them, the city's great philanthropist holding a gun, confronted by a detective, with another man standing in a hidden, prison-like room. Seizing the moment, Ben lunged for the file cabinet he had pried open. He pulled out a handful of files and threw them onto the floor in the doorway, in full view of the horrified guests. They weren't financial records. They were profiles, photographs of children, dozens of them, with names, ages, and physical descriptions. Below each photo was a number. Item number 8, item number 9, item number 10. They were missing children from all over the world, a catalog of stolen souls. A woman screamed. A man dropped his glass, the sound shattering the silence. The Vances' perfect world, their gilded cage, was ripped open. The raw, ugly truth of their secret was laid bare for all to see, illuminated by the harsh lights of Leo's prison. Not by a hero's vindication, but by the shocked and horrified eyes of the very society they had worked so hard to deceive. The aftermath of the gala was not a quiet cleanup. It was an explosion. The revelation in the Vances' study acted as a detonator, sending shockwaves that rippled out from the manicured lawns of the Heights to shake the very foundations of the city. And then the world. The arrest of Eleanor and Julian Vance, caught red-handed with their catalog of stolen children, was merely the first domino to fall. Before the sun rose, the Vance mansion was no longer a crime scene under the jurisdiction of the Oakhaven PD. It had been commandeered by the FBI. Federal agents, clinical and efficient, descended on the property, turning the Palace of Horrors into a meticulously documented federal case. The story was too big, its tentacles too far-reaching, for a local police department to handle. It was a scandal of international proportions. The Vances' fall from grace was absolute and terrifyingly swift. Their names, once synonymous with charity and influence, became bywords for monstrous depravity. News vans camped outside their estate, broadcasting their shame to a horrified world. The network they had so carefully built crumbled overnight. The wealthy and powerful friends who had flocked to their parties now scrambled to distance themselves, their public statements of shock and condemnation ringing hollow. Federal investigators, armed with the files Ben had discovered, began a global manhunt, following the money trails and client lists to unearth a conspiracy that implicated billionaires, politicians, and foreign dignitaries. The gilded cage had been shattered, and the creatures that had fed from it were now scurrying from the light. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was a mixture of stunned pride and deep institutional shame. They had harbored monsters, but one of their own had been the one to expose them. Ben Carter, the quiet beat cop, was now the reluctant center of a storm of attention. He was debriefed for hours by the FBI, his methodical, detail-oriented account of his investigation impressing the federal agents with its clarity and lack of ego. He was no longer just a cop. He was the key witness in the biggest case the state had ever seen. It was in the weary quiet of the following evening, in the harsh fluorescent light of the precinct, that Detective Miller found him. Ben was nursing a cup of stale coffee, trying to process the seismic shift in his own life. Miller approached, not with his usual blustering authority, but with a heavy, humbled weariness. "Carter," he said, his voice stripped of its usual condescension. He slid a thick file folder across the table. It was the official interrogation file for Julian Vance. "I just finished his initial processing. The feds will take him from here." Ben looked at the file, then at Miller, confused. "It's your collar, Carter," Miller said, his gaze steady and direct. "You earned it. The arrest report, the lead investigator credit. It's all yours." It was more than an apology. It was a profound act of professional surrender and atonement. In the rigid, credit-obsessed world of policing, giving up a high-profile collar like this was unheard of. It was Miller's way of admitting that Ben had been the true detective all along. He was ceding the victory, acknowledging that Ben's gut instincts had triumphed where his own by-the-book arrogance had failed. "I was wrong," Miller said, the words clearly costing him. "I saw a uniform and a hunch, and I didn't look deeper. You saw a kid who needed help, and you never stopped looking. That's the job. You did the job." He nodded once, a gesture of newfound respect, and walked away, leaving Ben with the file that officially closed the darkest chapter of his career. A week later, Ben was summoned to the office of the chief of police. He went expecting a formal hearing, a discussion of the protocols he had broken. Instead, the chief, a man with tired eyes who had seen it all, offered him a seat. "I've read Detective Miller's report and the FBI's preliminary findings." The chief began. "You broke at least a dozen regulations. Carter, you conducted an unauthorized investigation. You broke into a private residence. By all rights, I should suspend you." Ben remained silent, bracing himself. "But what you did," the chief continued, leaning forward, "is the kind of police work that can't be taught in an academy. It's the kind that reminds us why we put on this badge in the first place." He opened his desk drawer and took out a detective's shield. "There's an opening in the Special Victims Unit. It's a tough assignment. It'll chew you up if you let it. But I think it's where you belong." The SVU, the very unit that had handled the Amberfield case, the ghost that had haunted him for 5 years. The chief was offering him not just a promotion, but a chance to confront his past, to turn his greatest failure into his life's purpose. "I accept," Ben said, his voice firm. His first unofficial act as a detective was to visit the county's Child Services Center. Sarah Jenkins met him in the lobby. She looked exhausted, but there was a light in her eyes he hadn't seen before. "They've identified him," she said as they walked down a quiet hallway. "Leo's real name is Daniel. He was taken from a playground in Belgium 3 years ago. His parents have been notified. They're flying in tomorrow." She led him to a room with a large one-way mirror. Inside, a boy was sitting on the floor with a child psychologist, stacking colored blocks. It was Leo Daniel. He was quiet, but his watchfulness was different now. He wasn't scanning for threats. He was observing, learning. He seemed, for the first time, like a child in a safe place. Ben watched him, a lump forming in his throat. All the risks, the fear, the insubordination, it all melted away in that moment, crystallizing into this one quiet image of a little boy stacking blocks. "You know, when you first called me, I thought you were just another burned-out cop on a crusade," Sarah said softly. Standing beside him, "I was wrong." She looked at the boy, then at Ben. "You didn't just save him from a fire, Ben. You saved him from being a ghost. You gave him his name back." Ben couldn't speak. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the boy. The new calm he felt was not the absence of trouble, but the presence of purpose. He had stepped into the fire and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but whole. 1 year later, the Oakhaven Police Department's Special Victims Unit was housed in a quiet, unassuming corner of the precinct. But it was the building's new heart. The atmosphere here was different from the frantic energy of patrol or the competitive swagger of homicide. It was a place of quiet intensity, of deep empathy, and of a fierce, unwavering focus on the city's most vulnerable. It was, Ben Carter had discovered, where he had always belonged. Detective Carter was no longer the weary, jaded officer haunting the night shift. The 15 years of fatigue had not vanished, but they had been repurposed, transformed into a patient, profound understanding of human fragility. The cynicism had given way to a guarded hope, a belief not that he could save the world, but that he could save one child at a time. And sometimes, that was enough. He was respected, not for the single, explosive act of heroism that had made the papers, but for the quiet, daily work he did now. He was known for his ability to talk to traumatized children, to sit with them in silence until they felt safe enough to share their secrets. He could spot the lie in a parent's overly eager smile or the fear in a child's averted gaze from across a room. His past failure, the ghost of the Amberfield case, was no longer a source of haunting guilt, but a well of hard-won wisdom. This afternoon, he was not in an interrogation room, but in a classroom at the police academy. He was leading a new, mandatory training seminar he had designed himself. It was called Look Twice. The room was full of fresh-faced, eager rookies, their uniforms crisp, their eyes full of the same conviction he remembered having himself. On the large screen behind him was a redacted case file, stripped of names and locations, but not of its essential, chilling facts. It was the case of Leo. "Your gut instinct," Ben told the recruits, his voice calm and steady as he paced before them, "is the most important piece of equipment you will ever be issued. It doesn't run on batteries, and you can't get it recertified. You have to trust it. You have to nurture it." He pointed to a detail in the report on the screen. The initial responding officer noted that the child seemed detached. The parents explained it away as shock. The fire investigator's report ruled the cause as accidental. Every box was checked. Every procedure was followed. On paper, this was a tragedy, but it was a closed case. He let his gaze travel across the room, meeting the eyes of the young officers. But the first officer on the scene couldn't let it go. There was a detail that didn't fit an old burn mark. A small thing, but small things are where the truth hides. He looked twice. He pushed. He broke protocol. He risked his career. And because he did, a global child trafficking ring was exposed, and dozens of children were saved. He didn't tell them the officer was him. He didn't need to. The story was the lesson. "You will be pressured to close cases quickly," he continued. "You will be intimidated by wealth and influence. You will be told to ignore your instincts in favor of the official report. Don't do it. When you feel that cold knot in your stomach that tells you something is wrong, listen to it. Look twice, always. Because you might be the only person standing between a child and a lifetime of darkness." He was paying it forward, transforming the harsh lessons of his own journey into a shield for the next generation of officers. He was teaching them not just to be cops, but to be guardians. The final symbolic image of Ben Carter's second spring, the closing scene of his long, dark chapter, took place on a sun-drenched Saturday afternoon. He wasn't in uniform. He was in a public park, standing under the shade of a large oak tree, just another anonymous citizen. In the middle of a green, sprawling soccer field, a chaotic game was underway among a group of 10 and 11-year-olds. Ben's eyes were fixed on one of them, a boy with dark hair, quick on his feet, who darted after the ball with a fierce, joyful concentration. He was laughing, a loud, genuine, carefree sound that carried across the field. It was Daniel, the boy formerly known as Leo. He was living with a loving foster family while the final international arrangements were being made for his reunion with his birth parents. The trauma was still there, a shadow deep in his eyes, but it no longer defined him. He was a boy again, playing in the sun. As if sensing he was being watched, Daniel paused in his game, looking toward the edge of the field. His eyes found Ben's. For a moment, he just stared, a flicker of recognition in his gaze. Then, a wide, radiant, unambiguous smile broke across his face. He lifted a hand and waved, and Ben Carter smiled back, a real, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. He lifted his own hand and gave a small, slow wave. It was a simple gesture, a silent acknowledgement between the rescued and the rescuer, the guardian and his charge. He stood there for a long time, watching the boy play, the sound of children's laughter mingling with the rustle of the leaves. The ghosts of his past, the haunting face of the Amberfield girl, the cold emptiness of the gilded cage, were finally at peace. The ledger was balanced. the story had found its proper ending. If this story stirred your heart, if it reminds you that courage can alter destinies and that light always finds a path even in the deepest darkness, please leave a comment. Share this story with those who need inspiration. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss our upcoming stories.